everything, and it's just like a mission. I feel so bad that we were unable to make that happen.
We went out to eat.
Oh, other times, yes. Yes, we did. We went to that Ichiban steak, a Japanese steak, years and years ago on that. Wait a minute, that too. Oh,
And your dog.
and that's why I'm getting this need. Well, get them both replaced. Let's start with one. Get that done so I could get a dog. Remember, you're going to take some of
Oh,
those.
yeah, had a dog now.
Well, because I was caregiving for my mom, I moved in with her for 5 years. She's been gone now a year and a half. She died the day after Christmas. So it'll be 2 years this coming. So I've had a lot of loss, but I heart just grieve for you, the losses that you have. So anyway, but it's so great to see. Can I pull up the camera right here? Good, thank you.
That's why we came
So I will knock down the camera.
Yeah, I remember.
That's German Shepherds, yeah.
I'm going to get started in 1 minute to honor your time and mine.
Yeah, I can still see your dogs. I remember one time you came by too, and there were your dogs.
But they were gentle giants. But they were pretty well socialized, easy going. But yeah, no, they were big shepherds, especially my male Hogan. He was a big guy, yeah.
Boy, I always wanted my grandfather to have a German Shepherd when I was
Top or young guy, yeah.
5 years old. I still remember it because it was like that.
We're eye to eye, pretty much. Yeah.
But I always wanted to have them, but we had the shelters.
Oh, they're so smart and cute. Perky as heck. Yeah. Where do you live, may I ask? I mean, you're obviously in the area right now, Apple Valley. Okay.
I want to know where I'm at.
Okay.
Brother and going to high school. I know he's going the other way, and we're back in the neighborhood, and we're on Alamac, but the other side, compared to Edgewood.
Okay.
So we're pretty close by. Where are you at?
I'm over by Lac Lavon, just off of Garden View. I worked at Valley Middle for 25 years, and I was just about a 2-block walk. Took the footmobile to work. Not too many people can say
All right,
that.
friends, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just like last week, I just couldn't stop myself from adding more and more to the slideshow. So we'll see how far we get. We'll see what questions emerge. I loved the discussion last week, and if we get through half of what I prepared because there's questions and engagement, that is awesome. I really hope that continues this week. I know that some of you are joining for the first time that weren't here last weekend. So I thought I would just do kind of a cursory overview of what I covered last week. I'd love to hear, before we launch into this week's kind of further development of some of the stuff I'm talking about, I'd love to hear from you as I review it. Is there anything that you've found yourself thinking about over the last week? Like anything that I covered or a topic that we kind of wrestled with last week that you found sort of bubbling up for you in some way over the last week? So I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. Let me just review a little bit of what I covered last week. So the questions that I'm wanting to ask in this forum as we kick off the fall and think about who we are and who we're called to be. The first is, what's going on? Like, what's going on in this world? And if we can get really honest about that, how might that inform who we are called to be as church? Church in the world and church in 2023. I am encouraging us to think about starting with the theme of listening, and I'm hoping that toward the end of the presentation today I can kind of get back to this theme of listening. I present listening as a potential avenue into our work in the world because I think it's how we connect with other humans. I think it's something we often think we do naturally, and yet it's a skill that takes practice and intention. I think it's a way of thinking of ourselves in relationship to the world, not as one of judging, critiquing, but as one of listening. Like, we want to learn and we want to hear what's happening in the world so that we know how we can respond. And it allows us, in any experience of listening, what I find really profound about listening is it gets us outside of the driver's seat And we start by just paying attention to what is offered to us. And I think for the church, this may be exactly what we're called to be about, is to not think we know all the answers, to not think we know exactly what will bring people in, per se, and to get curious, to start listening, and to see where that leads us, rather than us thinking we already know from the get-go. I shared a few quotations around how we can think of ourselves in the world. The one that I just wanted to repeat this morning is the one from Pastor Rich. Does anyone remember this quotation when I said the only place that our omnipresent God is not is?
Illusion.
Yes, in illusions. When we make up stories about what's going on, when we work really hard to convince ourselves that this isn't really what's happening, we are really residing in illusions. And what this pastor is putting in front of us is that's the only place where God is not. God works with reality. God works with truth. Even the really, really hard ones. The closer we can get to what's really happening, perhaps the closer we are getting to God who is working in reality. So these sessions are really about kind of urging us to wrestle with reality. I think the church sometimes likes to pretend we can stay in illusions, and maybe that will get us closer to God, and I really think we're invited to be honest about the reality in which we live. So then I sort of turn to like, okay, so what are some of the things we can say about the reality in which we find ourselves? The first was that we certainly find ourselves in the wilderness of a post-pandemic world, and I call it a wilderness intentionally because it is not really clear where we are, which way to go. The threats feel a little bit more present to us. Landmarks are unclear, right? We are in this wilderness, a place where God's people have spent a lot of time. So I find it to be a reality worth naming and worth trusting that God can work with. But it is a wilderness, and I just think it's really good to acknowledge how many of our footholds and how many of the things we thought were like certain feel not so right now. And I think that's good to be honest about. But I also suggested last week that while the pandemic, I think one illusion that we might like to reside in is thinking that the pandemic caused it all. Like the church was doing great, and then the pandemic. Certainly the pandemic affected us. There is no question about that. But I also think the pandemic revealed a lot of changes that were already going on. So to sort of, for those of you who were here last week, I talked about one of those changes that was going on long before the pandemic started, was this movement from age of association to age of authenticity. Does anyone remember age of association? Kind of what goes with that way of structuring ourselves?
Membership.
Membership.
Belonging to groups.
Belonging to groups.
Your identity is based off of that.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So it was just part of the kind of cultural milieu that people joined things. People believed that coming together was the way to accomplish things and that it brought meaning to people's lives and a sense of identity by joining with these different groups. I mentioned the denominations formed during the Age of Association. Churches really exploded during this age, and the age helped churches. Like there was a lot happening in the culture that allowed churches to take off. Then we moved, starting with like the late 60s, but certainly moving into like 80s, 90s, 2000s, to the age of authenticity. And what does that look like? What are the sort of governing ideas of that age?
I want to be me.
Individualism.
I want to be me.
I want to be me. Mm-hmm. And sort of a resistance to turning to institutions, groups, associations to define a sense of identity, right? There's kind of an allergy to that in a way that has caused a lot of good. It has really elicited a kind of freedom to define oneself apart from some of the things we tend to assume about people. It's also contributed to a lot of loneliness and alienation and sort of swimming in this sea of like, who am I now? Being a kind of a daily question that people are trying to ask. I suggested last week that rather than think of one being better than the other, I really do think that both have gifts to offer us. that the age of association gives us a sense of belonging to something greater than ourselves, which is what I actually think people that are in the age of authenticity need. And yet the age of authenticity is asking churches that formed in the age of association to have a more compelling case, to have a better why than my grandma loved Jesus. We need something more compelling than that. I interpreted the religious nuns as the largest growing religious group in America. Religious might be arguable. Some of them consider themselves religious. Many of them consider themselves spiritual, but are a little uncomfortable with the word religious. But if you read the interpretation of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, by nuns it means that they have no kind of religious affiliation. Many of them, the majority of them, claim to believe in God and are spiritually curious, very spiritually curious. So they're hungering for many of the things we claim to offer in the church. Some of them haven't even thought to look in a church for these things. Some of them have looked and have felt it is too hard to find it. And so are finding it more in meditation, yoga, the gym, nature, these other ways of trying to kind of access the things that we say we're about here at church. And then the last part that we talked about was that there are other things that are taking the place of religion. So there are things that people are sort of grasping for to try to have a sense of meaning and a sense of identity in the world. And we talked about productivity, work, success, sports, politics, were some of the things we named last week. All of which are providing some meaning, but whether they're actually contributing to a sense of self outside of merit, capability, is very questionable, and I think probably we would say it can't. Okay, that was my super speed style from last weekend. Anything else that people want to lift up as something that's sort of stuck with them since last weekend before we move forward? Okay. Did any of you walk away having learned something last weekend? Cool. Okay, so just want to make sure we're kind of moving through this together.
Sarah?
Yeah.
We couldn't be here last week. I did listen to a portion of it online, but when we speak about spirituality, is spirituality the same or similar or disparate from faith? Spirituality versus faith.
What do you think?
Sounds like a therapist.
For myself, I focus on my faith, I guess. And for me, faith requires community. And so this is my community. And I have other community out there in the world that aren't grounded in faith.
Yeah. So, Martin Luther liked to define faith as trust. Trust in God and in the gifts of God, the provision of God, the grace of God. I think often we get stuck a little bit in the creedal confessions, the kind of do you believe the right things, at the detriment to more of our spiritual growth. What would it mean day to day to actually really trust that God's got it? And how could we be better at church about teaching some of the practices that might help that trust deepen even more? I think pairing intellectual, I'm a big intellect, so I love learning about words, digging into translations, and I could live my life there. Increasingly so, though, I realize that's not enough. And it's the moments when I'm anxious about something with my kids, when I have too much to do in a day, when I'm facing something in my body that feels uncertain. I need something a little bit more than Luther's treatises. I need a practice that can help me breathe, stop, wonder, trust other people have it alongside me. The things that sort of, I would say would be practices of spirituality. If I had to say this, and I hate generalizations, but I feel like in some ways the mainline church has has sort of felt comfortable in more of the brain side of things, and I love that about us. And we talked a little bit last week about the more evangelical tradition. I don't think they have enough brain sometimes, you know? But I also think that if we get too comfortable there, we aren't necessarily exercising and practicing some of the gifts of a more spiritually centered and kind of the spiritual practices. Which if I had to say something that I'd really love to do more of at Grace, that's one of them. Is convening us simply to practice some spiritual practices together. Just like try it. Because I think it's something our tradition is yearning for and hasn't necessarily done a lot of. Does that help answer your question at all? Respond to your question? I'm not answering it. Yeah.
Sure. When she asked about spirituality and faith, you mentioned earlier things like yoga and nature, and for me, Lake Superior, those are spiritual places too, so that spirituality can be beyond just the organized church, other ways of experiencing it. So.
I see this Venn diagram. Yeah, there you go. Math minds.
Everybody's own Venn diagram.
Everybody's own Venn diagram where there's a meeting of faith and spirituality in the middle, but we also have that brain side and the other side too, spirituality. Where we find God.
Thank you, Craig.
Make sure you got it straight. That more, make that left.
You know, where you find God for me, that's nature and singing and quilting.
Well, and I remember last week I shared the Barbara Brown Taylor book. Like, I don't go to God, I don't go to church because it's the exclusive place to find God. I go to church so that I can find God everywhere else I go. Like, I think at our best, we are training eyes to see God in nature, in even conflict, in relationships, in work. At our best, we're integrating. At our worst, we're like housing God here and then sort of approaching the world as though it's void of God. And I really don't think that that's true. Anything else? Yeah, Mike.
When you start your show there, will you turn off some of the lights?
Oh, sure.
It's hard to see the
Starting
stage.
my show.
When does the dancing start?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Do you see it better? Great.
No, we can't see you.
Yeah, that's right. You see me plenty. And we'll just apologize to the recording if they, only see a blob up here. Okay, so a couple of the things that I wanted to mention to continue in this vein of what's going on in the world. This is something that I spoke to in a sermon, I don't know, a couple months ago maybe, after I had read an article, but I think it's really, really important to think about. All the things that I'm mentioning, I said this last week, in no way am I trying to be exhaustive about all the things that are happening in the world, but I'm really trying to name a few things that I think are really prominent and things that I think really address our calling as church. So I've been intentionally selective. This is one of the ones that I come back to a lot because I'm really concerned about it, and I think it's really prevalent. So let me share a couple things. Our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has declared that we are living through an epidemic of loneliness. And he is intentionally calling it a public health issue because of how many people it's affecting, and because it's a public health issue that we could totally ignore. Like, it's not very easy to assess, to quantify, but he does have, obviously, research to substantiate this. He's identified that over the last few decades, we have become less connected to each other. We have forgotten how to rely on each other. We have begun to paint pictures of our lives on social media that are not real, but that give the impression that they are real. We have moved more often. And all of this is causing people to feel more alone, to feel more on their own. And it's affecting us both individually and societally, obviously. Half of Americans claim to feel chronically lonely, with the highest degree of loneliness being amongst our young people, ages 15 to 24. They have 70% less social interaction with their friends than they did just 2 decades ago. And this is not surprisingly leading to substantial increases in anxiety, depression, suicide, and violence. While loneliness is most prevalent in Generation Z, Vivek is really clear to say that it doesn't discriminate. That the latest research indicates no major differences between men and women or between races. But to go back to Generation Z, it is true that they are the first generation that are raised on screens. And so they are most likely to feel lonely, and they self-report that they are in worse health than any other generation, including the elderly. The number of school-aged children and adolescents hospitalized for suicidal thoughts or attempts has doubled since 2008. The other thing that Dr. Murthy says is to combat loneliness, people are often told to just get out there. Join a church, take up a sport, invite people to dinner. But what's missing there is the truth and feel alone even in the presence of others. Having people around you doesn't automatically make you feel less alone. He argues that it's all about the quality of interaction. Does someone notice you? Does someone ask you a question? Does someone learn your name? Does someone really listen to you as you share? I think this is a critical thing for us to pay attention to as we live our lives outside of this place. But I also think it's a critical thing for us to pay attention to within the walls of this place. I think that statement, you can feel lonely even when you're around other people. Just last week, someone shared with me that they're a newer member here at Grace. And they said, everyone's really friendly. Everyone says hello to me. And then they move on to talk to the person they know. And I'm left sort of standing there. This is a loving observation. This is human behavior. It's not a surprising dynamic, but I do think many experience a sense of loneliness even within a sense of community, even within gathered people. Dr. Murthy urges the following things as we live through this time. He says we need to strengthen neighborliness and community. He suggests that everyone spend 15 minutes each day connecting with someone that you care about, and it has to be outside your home, outside the people you live with. He tells a story in his TED Talk about his first time. He served as Surgeon General twice, and the first time he just went all in. It's all he did. He worked long hours, he came home, slept, went back to work, worked long hours, and he lost a lot of his connections. He didn't have time, he felt, to connect with other people, so he sort of just shut it all down. After doing this research and after having children, he really confronted this in himself, like that he was lonely. But he describes being really nervous to reach back out to people that he hadn't been in touch with for a decade. And every single time he reached out and said, hey, I miss you, sort of dropped the ball here, but I'd love to reconnect. Not once was the person anything but eager to reconnect. So when we have these fears of like reconnecting with people we've lost touch with, he really wants to sort of disintegrate that fear and urge us to reach out anyway. The other thing he says that is vital is when you are connecting with another person, to give them your full attention. It's been said that if you're sitting like at a meal and you have your phone up, people don't feel like you're with them. We've all had this experience and we've all done it, right? Because at any moment, what you're communicating is, if this lights up, I'm gonna leave you for a second, see if that matters more to me, I'll be back. And then, right, but when that's even there, the sense of attention is diminished. The third thing he says, or I guess there's more than that, another thing he says is find a way to serve others. He says it's counterintuitive, but very effective. It forges a connection with someone else, and it affirms that we have value to bring to the world. And the last thing is to limit social media. Don't utterly disband it, but pay attention to whether or not you're counting on it to fulfill a need for connection. It lies to us, makes us feel connected, and yet it's not actually providing the sense of connection that we all need. Also, as we think about what's going on in the world, we pray every single week, your kingdom come. think all of us, in watching the news this week, have prayed it over and over and over again. I've created this slide before, obviously, the violence in the Middle East. But some of the things that we can't talk about what's going on in the world without talking about the matters of injustice that we as Christians are called to care about and to respond to. So to just put a few up here, obviously we are living through a time of racial reckoning. We're living in a world with increasing discrimination against the LGBTQ community, especially our trans siblings. And we are in what experts are calling, like the wake-up image, what experts are calling the decisive decade around climate change. That in the next 10 years, we're going to show whether or not we have the potential to reverse carbon footprint. Finally, as we think about what's going on in the world, there's this. Let's just do a collective groan. My thoughts on this, we are indeed going into an election year, and I think we know it's going to be ugly. And we know that even when we try to remain steady and hopeful, even when we sort of discipline ourselves around how often we expose ourselves to what's happening in the news, the polarizing of people and the degradation of public discourse affects all of us, and it affects our church too. I'm sure many of you remember this and maybe still are experiencing it in your families. The family dinner table conversation, when was it? In 2016, like Thanksgiving dinners? I just remember so many people dreading it, right? Like, what are we going to talk about? We can't talk about that. But even beyond, even if you're not deliberately talking about a candidate or a party or an issue, the truth is that our dialogue between us is becoming toxic, right? We've sort of forgotten how to have civil discourse, how to respect differences, how to relate to each other without putting each other in boxes right away, and how to really listen to what each other is saying. These are the basic building blocks of society. And so I'm really wondering, as we go into 2024, if as we think about that being one of the many things that is happening in the world, what might we be called to be practicing here at Grace to sort of invigorate the way that we know to be human as we live in a world that's not helping us practice that at all? So I mention all of this, and this is what I started with, because I think it helps us to be in touch with reality rather than clinging to illusions. It helps us to tell the truth about the world in which we live, which is just vital if we're going to respond truthfully and hopefully. I also think it's really critical that we think of ourselves as located in the world and not against the world. Like, we participate in all the things that I've named. We are not immune from them, but we also know some things about the possibilities and the hope that we can bring. I also name all of this, and I really want to put a point on this one, to honor the grief that is in our bodies, that is in our church, that is in our communities, and of course our wider society. I think if we just pause to think about what have you lost in the last 5 years, all of us would hang around a while and have quite a list of certainly people who meant something to us, but I also think principles, I think values, sense of community and belonging, sense of who I am in this wilderness. There's a lot of grief. And for me, when I think about the grief that fills this community and the grief that fills our world, I do really think about having sort of a softness and a gentleness around how we are with each other. Because I just sort of know that when we are together, grief is one of the things that's in the room. And so I just want to make sure, even as I'm going to encourage us to think about being open to the changes and letting it inspire us to think about being church in new ways, I don't want that to feel like I'm ignoring or diminishing in any way the grief that we all feel. And then finally, I'm laying this out in front of us, not to make us further depressed about the state of things, which I know that when we kind of look at all that together, it does feel pretty big. But I also think it has a way of making it clearer, the treasure and the gift that we have to offer the world. We started to get there last week as we talked about reminding one another of our worthiness, apart from our titles, apart from our income, apart from a good grade on a test, apart from a college entry. Like what we have here says you are worthy of love, not because of any of those things. Great when they happen, and okay when they don't, because that's not where we find our worth. That's the message we have. And I think paying attention to some of the things that are going on in the world might help us get even more bold in how we claim that. This is a quotation that I'm sure many of you have heard. It's shared, I think, with every single person that's considering ministry, but I think it's apt for all of us. The place that God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Can we just say that together? The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. It's another way of getting at what I'm trying to present today, is as we look at the world's deep hungers, and we think about where our deep joy comes from. Like, where's that intersection? And maybe that's a place to begin. So 3 things, as I try to bring this a little bit closer to home, as I look at Grace Lutheran Church, I have 3 responses to what I've shared so far. And the first one is that we don't have to know. Like, as we think about this wilderness that we're in and all these things that are happening, we don't have to know the way forward. And I actually think that when we think we know, we do, I'm not going to say more harm than good, but I do think we have a tendency to then stay in what we've always done. When we listen, like, what's happening out there? Where are those deep hungers? Where are the deep groans for belonging? When we get ourselves out of the way and listen, I think we're led in some new directions. So I just want to free us, and I'm freeing myself right alongside you, to be okay with not having it all figured out. I actually think that's where, Janet, to come back to your word, I think that's where faith begins. Is not when we're certain, but when we're not. And when we have to be led by something beyond our own certainty into a future we can't yet know. Having said that, I think we know some things. I think we know a lot of things. To name a few, and I'd love to hear what you think too, we are given a story and an orientation to life that responds to so many of the challenges and heartbreaks that I've mentioned. We know that we belong because of God. We know that we can't do life on our own. We know that there are second chances. We know that there are other ways of doing things. We know we aren't in control. We know that love can exist between people even when they see things differently. We know that we can live through hard times because we have people praying for us. We have a God who cries with us. And we have the Easter promise that resurrection will somehow come on the other side of anything that has died. We know some things. And I think tapping even more deeply into what we know is a response to what's going on in the world. And then, pairing unknowing and knowing, we get to then ask ourselves, what do we want to create? That's really the question in front of us. What do we want to create? How do our passions at Grace respond to the deep hungers of our world? And what I'm going to lead us into next as one possibility is, could the practice of listening be a window into what's possible? What if we were a community that actively practiced the art of listening? I'm going to talk about listening a little bit more, but any questions, thoughts that are emerging for you so far? So I have to admit that I think before we read the book that Council read this year, it was called Leading Faithful Innovation, Following God into a Hopeful Future, which, if anyone wants to know sort of at least one of the resources that is highly shaping the work of the council and the work of your leadership team and pastors, this is certainly one of them. And then this past week I read 2 books, The Listening Life, Embracing Attentiveness in a World of Distraction, and a book by Kate Murphy, You're Not Listening. what you're missing and why it matters. I think I can just admit to you that before I read these books, I don't think I would have even thought to mention listening. Like, I think I just thought that happens. Like, that feels so basic. It's happening all the time. Why would that be the thing that would rise to the top? But the more that I thought about the world that we live in, the more that I thought about loneliness and the sort of disintegration of communities and a sense of belonging, the more I've thought about how many times I've been called to respond, especially to families where a youth is going through a mental health crisis, the more I'm led to this theme as wondering, where can we get if we're not doing this first? And could it be that sometimes we like to kind of leapfrog over practices like listening to try to get to the bigger things, get to the more important things? I know we want to be about justice in the world. I know we want to be about welcoming new people when they come through our doors. I know we want to foster a real sense of community here. And I don't know if any of those things can happen if we aren't working on our listening. We talk a lot about, like, go out and meet the neighbors. But what do I ask? What do I say? What do I do with what I hear? Like, I think there's a little bit of a trepidation in this. I think it's a kind of a vulnerable practice. But I really am getting clearer that if we aren't kind of practicing listening here, I'm not sure what more we can do in those areas that we sort of automatically talk about as church. Let me just talk about listening a little bit. If you can see that, there's a lot of text on this slide. As I said last week, I think that most things that happen begin with listening. Creation came into being by listening to God. The Hebrew word, Jewish communities begin all of their prayers with the word Shema, which means listening. So Jewish children are instructed to rehearse these words as they rise in the morning and as they fall asleep. From dawn until dusk, their lives are made by listening. The fishermen became disciples by listening to a voice that said, "Come and follow me. I'll make you fishers of people." The rule of Benedict, which is a rule that shapes monastic communities and has for several centuries, the very first word in that rule, which is just a guideline for life together, is the word listen. To bring it a little closer to home, the voice of our parents is something we hear before we're born. The only way we know a name to be called is because we first heard ourselves called it. We learn things like rhythm and math, friendship and love through listening. Probably many of us can remember the first time a significant person said, "I love you," and what that meant. Listening is foundational to what it means to be human. And throughout the Bible, listening is the central act of the people of God. When we gathered as a council at our retreat in August, we sort of bonded over the fact that we don't necessarily gather around listening to Scripture and to God as often as we wish we did. We sort of just talk as though we do it. And yet when we started our retreat by listening to Scripture and sort of letting it kind of wash over us, and then by partnering up and saying, what are you hearing in this? First of all, we heard 11 different things, which is good. And we also heard each other speaking to it. There was this like dynamic interplay between Scripture and ourselves and one another. And afterwards, at least my experience was, my goodness, we don't do this often enough. Like practicing listening together to the voice of God in Scripture. This is a comic that comes from the New Yorker. This guy has a glass of wine, is at a party, and it says at the bottom, "Behold, as I guide our conversation to my narrow area of expertise." We've all been there. So when I asked the question, like, what actually is listening, it's really interesting. In both of these books on listening, the authors acknowledge how hard it is to define what listening is. And it's a whole lot easier to define what listening is not. So let's start there. What is listening not? I want participation here. Let's wake up.
Waiting to respond.
Waiting to respond. So as someone talking to you, you're like, what am I going to say?
Interrupting.
Yep. Interrupting. Good.
Well, it's self-centeredness in, like, it's not a self-centered activity of what I'm getting. So.
Right. And the kind of like response that's like, it always brings it back to you, right? Or if you feel that when someone's talking, like, yeah, I've had that experience, and right, we're kind of right back with the person's own experience. What else?
Coming up with the answer.
Coming up with the answer.
Trying to fix it.
Yeah.
Fixing, yes. Did you hear something else back there? Okay. So what is listening? What would you say listening is?
Sometimes it feels like interrogating introverts. I don't know. Like, really? It's people that will just say stuff, fine, you can listen, easy enough. But introverts, you gotta follow up. You gotta ask the follow-up question. You have to be in there with and yes, that is, there is that rolling, but to get at more or bring more out, but I don't know. And that's some pandemic influence, but it's definitely interrogating introverts.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, Court.
Kind of following up that, being an introvert and having a very introverted son, is providing an environment that allows for talking. Because it is, when even asking a question, it's interrogation and you shut down. You need to provide an environment of, maybe we're not actually talking, we're playing a game, but in that environment it's comfortable and let's...
And silence, I suppose, too. Really
Yeah.
okay with silence.
There's some cool research out too about how some people love and savor sitting down at Starbucks and talking and really love that kind of very intense kind of focus. And I think probably more people though prefer gardening side by side and then kind of chatting or cooking side by side, or where there's a little bit of a
activity.
There's something to focus on. More of the side by side conversation can actually create an environment where some people feel more comfortable opening up. Yeah.
I think listening can also be being ready that the other person isn't ready to talk, or doesn't want to talk with you about whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Incorporating some empathy without judgment, maybe, wow, that sounds like it was really hard.
Yes. Yes. That makes me think of, I heard this on a podcast a couple of years ago about this guy that goes, whenever he goes to a party, when he asks what someone does for work, every single time he responds, that sounds so hard. And every single time people are like, it is! So the power of empathy, right? He's like, no matter what, if they collect garbage, if they're doing database entry, if they're what, it's hard. It's all hard. It just is, yeah.
I think listening is involving the intent of understanding what you're interacting with.
Yes, yeah. One of the, when Andrew and I did premarital counseling, one of the activities that they had us do was around active listening. And the way that exercise goes is that they recommend this for times of tension, but I actually think it's good no matter what, is to just say, I'm gonna let you talk, and before I say what I'm thinking, I'm gonna say back to you what I think I heard you say. And I will just say that when Andrew and we have to sort of announce that we're doing this, right? It doesn't just naturally flow into active listening. We have to say okay, we need a moment to even see if we're hearing each other here. And I mean, we've done some good work in listening in our relationship and in our work. But almost every time when we say back, is this what I'm hearing? I would say I get it about 82% right. Because I can't listen without completely taking myself out. I, of course, have some thoughts about what's being shared. So that practice of just repeating back to someone, before I just move forward, I want to just check this. Is this what I heard you say? And it gives that person a chance to say, yes, yeah, that's exactly it. Or, well, kind of. I guess what I was trying to say is, right? And it helps, I think, get a little clearer between speaker and listener to say back, here's what I heard you say, before we just automatically keep going into what we have to say and thinking we've heard each other the whole time. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But not everybody wants to be actively listened to. And what I mean by that is if you're having a conversation with somebody and they say something and you respond back with what you think they said, why are you always getting so into everything? Just accept what I'm saying. And it's huh? So you've got to know that your audience is, or your speaker wants active listening as well. And you have to be open to it if you're the speaker.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I would say that most people long to be listened to. I think I would say that. But you're absolutely right, that there are some people that are more interested in sort of declaring and then out, right? Than actually wanting to engage, even through the idea that they've put on the table. That is absolutely a dynamic. Kate Murphy wrote this book. She's a journalist, writes for the New York Times, and she wrote this book because of what happened in her interviews. That she really felt like as she was asking people questions, what she observed is that people couldn't believe she actually cared to listen. So the book is about what unfolded as she just listened, because of how rare it is in our world. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on what a lot of people have been saying, there's a saying about listening means going into something with the intent to be changed. Because you have your own biases, you assume what Andrew's gonna ask you anyway, right? No, what the conversation is. But it's that idea of if you're truly listening with the intent to be changed. Like you're going into this without some preconceived notion of what the outcome should be or what you want the outcome to be.
Right.
But being open to that.
One of these authors talks about being transported. That actually at the beginning of the conversation to the end, you're in a different place than where you began. Yeah, right.
Now this morning on the Jane Pauley show, they had a little segment was about paying attention. And if you go to that this morning, you can look that up, and it's related to some of the things about listening and stuff, and how how our ability to pay attention is changed because of all of the electronics that we use and stuff like that, our devices. But
that's right.
Yeah, it was an interesting interview.
The thing that one of these authors says about the devices is that they've convinced us that listening and real in-person connection is unnecessary because they make us feel like we're getting it. Yeah, Lori, let's go with you first.
I just wanted to say that since you've been talking about this, I've been intentional about listening, and I think Jim probably can be attest to this. You have to be open for how long it might take. Conversation might go for a lot longer than you think.
Especially when you're talking to Jim.
Well, I was going to say especially when you're talking to my sister, but we talked for 2 hours. Or I just listened for 2 hours.
That's exactly, yes.
But I think that just being open to the amount of time, you might have to give up more time.
It's highly inconvenient and inefficient.
Yeah.
Bingo. It's the whole how are you and we just keep walking, Yeah. Because please don't say anything but good.
Yeah, what I was thinking about is just, it's hard work. It's hard work to be a good listener. But I think one of the things that I've been finding lately with the news, with all of this, or at least for me, I'm just feeling like all of these things going on is energy sapping. And so doing that listening skill is going to take more, because I've noticed that I haven't been posting. I just don't have the energy to respond. Sometimes I feel like I don't have the energy to reach out because all of this stuff going on in the world is too much. But then the other thing that I found, and I'm really grateful for, and this is a change in me, is I was upset with church, with faith, with what was going on in politics and everything. And this is where we talk about being a gift. This place is what the church here is trying to do collectively is really helping me to work through that.
Thanks for sharing that. Thank you. And I really wonder, Kathy, about I mean, we'll get there, but like, what if at Grace we could kind of like structure some more ways to practice listening to each other so that it wasn't all on us individually to find the energy for it? I mean, some of the stuff around spiritual practices, like what if we just like come to church tonight, all we're gonna do is hear scripture, sit in silence, offer to pray for each other, and go home. Like refuel by listening so that we can, you know, like so we don't have to engineer all the times where we're trying to do it. We can trust that we're gonna have a space there where we can practice it in the safety and welcome of our siblings in Christ. Just an idea. The thing that I found really profound in these books, it talks about, like, if you're going to get at a definition of listening, that it's really less about the mechanics. There's certainly skills to learn. There's certainly things we can develop in ourselves to be a better listener. But what these authors say is it's much more about one's heart, about how one shows up for another person, that demonstrates a powerful listener or not. You all know, like when people are, you know, sort of really clunky about trying to get a soft skill right, and then we all start there. But that I really liked this idea that it's about the heart of a listener and the kind of person and presence that makes us capable of listening. Yeah, Paula.
I think what you're describing there, though, is a difference between active listening and listening, because there is a difference.
Yeah, what would you say?
I would say that the active listening is more internalizing what the person you're talking to is saying, so that your heart is invested.
Yeah. People have also said like contrast between listening and hearing. You know, active listening and listening, right? That there's kind of you can hear sounds, you can hear a voice, you can hear, and may not actually be available to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Not invested.
Right. Right. I think we've mentioned a couple things that keep us from listening. Does anyone else want to add to what people have already shared? Devices I've heard named, time that it takes, right?
I think it's incredibly uncomfortable if two people are listening, because then there's no ideas being exchanged. You're just sitting there staring at each other, waiting for the other person to start.
That is uncomfortable.
That I find very uncomfortable.
Yes.
So if you're going to listen, you're going to have something to listen to.
Yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah.
My brain. It's constantly thinking and working, and I can't shut it off. And sometimes I need to shut off all my stuff to hear what somebody else is saying. So unfortunately, and I'll own up to this, I'm always thinking ahead of what you might be saying. And I try to shut it off, and that for me is the hardest part.
Yes. I appreciate you naming that. It's true. One of the authors talks about mental side trips.
I'm down the road.
Yeah, exactly. So like I know that this is happening, but I am, and I mean, what did they write? It has to do with something called the speech-thought differential, which basically means we can think a whole lot faster than someone can talk.
Amen.
Right? Yeah. You're not alone, sister. Yeah. This is what they write. We check out momentarily to wonder if we have spinach in our teeth. We remind ourselves to get milk on the way home or worry about how much time is left on the parking meter. We get sidetracked by things like the speaker's hair, clothing, body type, or maybe a large mole. Of course, the biggest distraction is thinking about what urbane, witty, or in contentious situations, devastating thing we want to say next. So yes. Yes. I hope you feel understood and not alone in that. Yeah. Anything else to add to that list? Okay. So a few things that actually happen when we listen. There's incredible research about what happens to us chemically when we listen, about how we actually, in time, our heartbeat starts to align with the person with whom we're talking. We learn about someone beyond what we initially see. We're stretched to think differently. We learn how to love. One person said we become more alive to the world and it more alive to us. I loved this quote. Listening is something you do or don't do every day. While you might take listening for granted, how well you listen, to whom and under what circumstances determine your life's course. And more broadly, our collective listening, or the lack thereof, profoundly affects us politically, socially, and culturally. We are, each of us, the sum of what we attend to in life. The soothing voice of a mother, the whisper of a lover, the guidance of a mentor, the admonishment of a supervisor, the rallying of a leader, the taunts of a rival are what form and shape us. So to end, and then I want to open it up for conversation, instead of measuring a church by its attendance and budget, let's assess it by the quality of community that disciples people to love well, and I added to listen well, a culture that equips individuals to have a first-hand life with God, and a commitment to work for healing in all areas of life in the way of Jesus. When we come here, we do, whether you're even thinking about it or not, I really do see worship as a place where we're practicing listening to something outside of all the other voices that come at us during the week. Certainly through the proclamation of the gospel and the sermon, but also the things that are named in our prayers, the voice of peace that we extend to one another. Today, the hilarity and cries and wiggliness of children. A table where there's food enough for everyone. I really see worship as the place where we choose to listen to the gospel. And we see it playing out imperfectly, of course, but we still get to see it. And I do think paying attention to what we listen to does become the life we lead. And I'm wondering about, as we go into 2024, what if we became a church that really prioritized practicing some of these very basic human-to-human things for the sake of our own growth and for the sake of our witness in the world? What are your thoughts?
I felt like that was needed.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, Martin.
Okay, at shared leadership Tuesday night, I experienced active listening. I was talking with someone, and it was wonderful because she listened, she asked questions that related to what I was saying, and I talked for quite a while, and it fit in exactly with what we're talking about today. This person listened and directed things back that I had said to expand on it, and it was really powerful. It was wonderful. So it does happen, and I had the joy of being able to have experienced that.
Yeah, Lori.
We kind of put together that line of assessed by the quality of community with the line that you had on another slide where your heartbeat changes, where it aligns with the person you're listening to.
Yes.
That right there is going to make me slow down and pay attention. Because I never thought of the fact that my heart and their heart would align.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. We can see each other. Yeah.
I'm curious to find out what that would look like, because we would need to create spaces where that listening could occur. Then once we listen, what do we do with what we've learned and where do we go? That alone is, it's such a broad way of thinking about this that I find that rather intriguing.
Yeah, and I don't have all the answers to that, but I do think I'm really curious if we gathered intentionally for, let's say, 6 weeks in small groups and practiced listening to each other, and then came back to a large group and said, what did we hear? What are people carrying? What are the burdens in this community that I know each of you could answer that question, and yet, I'm honest about how much I know or don't know about that for each of you, and how much I can possibly hold that for each of you. So I wonder about small communities where we would get to put our finger on the pulse a little bit more of the joys and the sorrows that exist in this community, which I think is one piece of wisdom, right? If we have it, Apple Valley has it, Lakeville has it, right? And then we've also talked on the council level about championing a listening team. training, doing some training around that, and then practicing listening with 50 different members of the community, not at all connected to grace. Not asking, like, what do you believe about God? Or what's your favorite Bible passage? But asking, like, what keeps you up at night? Where are you seeing people hurting in the people you serve? Where are you seeing possibility and joy? And just seeing, after 50 conversations, what did we learn there? So it's slow, it's organic, and it's vulnerable at the start because who knows what we're gonna hear. But the other option is, we know exactly what's happening. We form these groups, we do, and we plan a program and hopefully it works. And like we haven't necessarily done the first work of like listening to then wonder what might we have, what could we create that would respond to what we've heard? Instead of hoping we know, planning it, and then seeing if it relates. Does that help? That's where I'm at in my own discernment of like what we could create here. Yeah.
Two things come to mind. My therapist and I talk about grief and stepping into grief and then stepping out of it, because you can't stay in the intense work of actively processing grief all the time. You disintegrate. So we talk about stepping in grief and stepping out of grief, and I dubbed it the grief hokey pokey, which is a little irreverent. But each of us individually need to be able to step in and step out of the things that take a lot of energy to put in. And the other thing that comes to mind is, I don't remember where I heard this, but it was somebody talking about the work of justice within the community, and they were relating it to a choir and how a choir can sustain a note for a really, really, really long time if they each take turns breathing. Yeah.
It's a beautiful image. Thank you. Any other thoughts before we go into this world? This mad and beautiful world that we live
I
in?
have a thought. I keep thinking back to one of the early slides you have about isolation and how being invited into a listening session, if you've been feeling of isolation or feeling like I'm by myself, how uncomfortable, the word that was used earlier, that can be. And you have to have a lot of trust to be willing to be in that.
Yeah.
To like move from isolation into conversation that might include listening. I think that could be really uncomfortable. I mean, I'm here for it, like let's rise up and address that, but the only way to overcome isolation is to be in more intentional community with listening. But the act of like you engaging me in a long conversation of richness, I have to extend a lot of trust to say, oh, how do I talk to you about grief, or here's the things that are really rising up. And I'd be really curious to see the listening team, like how do you train somebody to break down so many walls so quickly in which to be meaningful at that time.